Hello everyone and welcome to an extra special episode of the Modern Brewer podcast with me, your host, Chris Lewington. I imagine you're thinking, what makes this episode extra special? Well, usually I record from my tiny flat in London, but right now I'm sitting in one of the craft brewing world's most popular maltsters, renowned for their world-class specialty malt and technical support, home of dextrin malt, premium English caramel, and crystal T50 TM. Have you guessed it yet? It's of course Simpsons Malt. But before we get into the episode, firstly, thank you to everyone I met or shared their kind words about the podcast at the Brewers Congress event in London. It really made me feel good about the pod and the strength of the future for it. The event itself was lit. The speakers were fantastic, beer was great, and the company outstanding as always. An extra special thank you to Convoy Kegs for hosting me at the award ceremony. Stainless steel kegs are expensive both economically and environmentally, and a lot of brewers are asking themselves, how do I stop losing them? The answer lies in the ability to track your kegs properly. If you can see where every keg is at all times, you will lose less. And for the first time, you'll be able to ensure the quality of your beer at the point of sale with temperature feedback. All of this is possible with Convoy Kegs. You can rent the kegs with the tracking or retrofit the tracking onto existing kegs. Search Convoy Kegs on LinkedIn to find Rich, Tom, or Christian. So, this recording is going to be broken into multiple episodes as the topic is quite broad, but each segment is essential to the overall understanding. In these episodes, we're going to talk all about certificates of analysis the maltsters send with every batch of malt. Let's be honest with ourselves, how many of us understand every bit of analysis, how it's analysed, what aspects of the malting process influences it, and most importantly, how does it affect the brewery? Well, we're going to cover all of this today. And let me tell you, I was fairly confident I understood most of a malt COA, but even in our preliminary chats, the guys really drop in knowledge I literally wish I had known before when I was working in breweries. It's really eye-opening to see what really is important to the maltster and what is important to the brewer. These episodes are recorded in person and live. Only the second time I've done this. And on top of that, there's two guests and me. So a real venture into the unknown. And to be honest, I have no idea how it'll turn out. As always, your feedback is essential to me to help shape the future. Okay, so here we go. And with me on these episodes are two legends in the malting world. Simpsons Technical Director and UK Sales, Jamie Ramshaw, and Technical Manager of Simpsons, Dr. Dan Cooper. Welcome to the show, Jamie and Dan.
Hello. Hey, Chris.
So guys, look, for those who might not be familiar with you, can you just introduce yourselves to the listeners, starting with you, Dan?
Right, okay, so I'm Dan. I suppose the doctor part is I did my degree and PhD in the 90s at Heriot-Watt. So originally the plan was to go into malting. My PhD was in high gravity brewing and foam stability. And then once I'd finished that, I did a postdoc at the Institute of Food Research in Norwich. Ended up then down at Brewing Research International, as it was at the time, but now it's Camden BRI. Spent a little bit of time there, and then left there and went into the malting industry. So been in the malting industry for the last 15, 20 years, at a number of maltsters. So starting off at Muntons, then at Bort Malt, and finding myself now at Simpsons.
Really have been around them all, eh?
Yes, and I've done my rounds.
All right, so Jamie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jamie Ramshaw. So I started brewing, I went to Heriot-Watt in 89 to 93, and then I started brewing in a small microbrewery. From there I went to Charlie Wells, and I was brewing and filtration manager, where I made high gravity beers and used PGA in order for the foam stability. After a long period there, I realised I'm better at talking about it than doing it. So I went to work for Murphy's, and actually as a sort of technical support brewer, and realised there were a million ways of making beer, not just the way you learn in your original brewery, which was very eye-opening. And then 6 years ago I came to Simpsons, and I basically just take people out for lunch.
Something I'm expecting pretty much straight after this podcast is finished recording.
You can edit that bit out.
No, keep that one in.
So have either of you done any podcasts before?
It's quite obvious we haven't.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a niche topic. I think there's one that does something on the malt COA in America. There's an MBA podcast, but nothing that's quite like this, I think. So kind of excited. I mean, quite an interesting question for me. Generally, for me, maybe more for you, Jamie, because I know you're dealing with brewers quite often. But generally, how well do you think malt COAs are understood by brewers?
I think it's a complete range. I think some people just file them away, ready for audits, and other people do look at them. And we also sometimes think they will worry about certain parameters that aren't worth worrying about, and not worry about others that aren't more worth worrying about.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm probably in that category at some point as well. So you read some things or you listen to them, and then you're like, oh my God, I need to start worrying about this all the time. Then actually the reality is that you probably don't, which is kind of what I want to cover a little bit in today's podcast. So I think we're going to definitely in part 2, that'll come up a bit more about some of the parameters that I think we probably think too much about as brewers. And definitely one of them, when we talked about it, I'd actually already done that. So I was like, guilty.
I think coming in on that, sort of, I think what Jamie's saying, I think some brewers understand the basics very well. So there's certain parameters that they know in and out. But I think what perhaps they don't know so much is how they all interrelate. And so you can't just change one without having an impact on another. I think that's the bit that would be really good to sort of try and get across, is that some of the parameters that some of our customers require us to hit in terms of the specification don't always work together. So it's just physically impossible for us to do. And that understanding of how they will interrelate would be really useful for a brewer to understand.
Yeah.
I have experience of that, where a maltings was supplying the brewery I was working at, and they had a concession with every load. And we finally had a discussion about that and said, well, your spec's impossible to make malt to.
So you always
so we said, so let's have a conversation with the maltster and actually come up with something that works.
Yeah. I think there's some similar situations with some places I've been as well, where we've asked for things that maybe this podcast is just for me, to be honest. All right, Dan. So maybe you can kick us off by talking a bit about what barley brings to the malting process, because I feel it might be important.
Yeah. Well, I suppose without barley, you don't have malt. Without malt, really, you don't have beer. So I think the big thing for me is that barley is a package of starch. You've got an endsperm and an embryo, and it's mainly the starch that's the biggest proportion of the grain, and that's what contributes your extract. That's what you're going to be turning into fermentable sugars, and that's what you're going to ferment into alcohol. So barley is a package of starch, but not only that, it has everything else that you need to be able to process that barley, that malt, into wort. Lots of different varieties. You've got the heritage varieties, Maris Otter, Chevalier, Golden Promise. You've got the more modern varieties, Laureate, Planet. They all come with slightly different sort of, I suppose, functionality, properties that they can contribute. But they all, to a certain extent, will behave in a similar fashion and will give you the same sort of thing. And I think that's the beauty of barley. I think if we go back historically, you look at where maltings are sited, they're in areas where the barley's grown, so all along the east coast of the UK, so starting in East Anglia, going up through Yorkshire into Scotland. Most of the malting sites will be in those areas where we're growing the grain. The land is suited for that. It's good for growing grain. It's also actually relatively flat, so it's nice, useful land for growing grain, and lots of grain. The one good thing which sort of I think we're very, very blessed with in the UK is that we do produce very, very good quality barley. And I think it's the maritime climate that we've got. So we're an island surrounded by lots of water. We've got the climate, the conditions that produce fantastic barley, and that enables us to produce fantastic malt.
It's never too hot, it's never too cold. There's plenty of rain. There's a nice dry bit at the end of the summer. Well, hopefully, that's what we're after. There's also, going on from that, we can go on to, there's winter varieties and spring varieties, although that's actually about when they're drilled, not when they're harvested. So a winter is basically drilled before Christmas, and a spring's drilled after Christmas. British barley, the winters don't actually need to vernalise, so they don't have to be drilled in the winter. They're just put in early, and the longer the growing time, the better the grain. And the farmer will like growing winters because it's a cover crop once they take harvested, but it also is the first crop they take out of the ground. So they can take the winter, then do the wheat, then do the springs, and it keeps the combine moving across the farm, so everything doesn't come ripe at the same time. Winters are getting scarcer now, aren't they? I think farmers, because winter wheat, feed wheat, there's such a good premium on it, and the yield is so high. We can see the price of winters going up actually, as we're fighting for land to get the growers to put it in for us. The springs there's plenty of springs.
And from a brewer's perspective, how important is that they understand which variety they're getting in, or is that more of a maltster's concern?
I think there's two parts to it, really. You've got the heritage varieties, which you almost separate from everything else because they create a story that brewers want to put their hat on. So Maris Otter, flavour. Maris Otter, Golden Promise, I mean, especially for us, Golden Promise, heritage variety, it does give a certain flavour profile that brewers like to sort of see in their beers. So I think you've got your heritage varieties that create a story that brewers like. Then you've got the more modern varieties, both winter and spring. When you're looking at spring varieties, I think that the movement in terms of spring varieties, certainly in the UK, is very much dominated by the distilling market. So the more modern varieties, especially Laureate, I mean, Concerto was the old one, Laureate, you're now looking at sort of things like Diablo, Firefox. They are created, or they've been bred very much with the end use of the distiller in mind. So they're very high extract, lots of starch. Good varieties in terms of deriving low nitrogen. So they're really good varieties for distilling.
And they yield high in the field, which gets the growers.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, especially sort of like when you're looking at breeding new varieties, the agronomics is the thing that will drive it the most. So it's almost like the agronomics are the key, and if it doesn't tick the box for agronomics, it doesn't progress to any further trials. So the malting trials, the brewing trials come after. Have we assessed that it's going to be better than the current varieties in terms of yield, disease resistance, all of those sorts of things? So breeders always want. We work quite closely with the breeders, so we're sort of telling the barley breeders what do our customers want. So what do the brewers want? What do the distillers want? And they will then look to try and breed those characteristics into the new varieties. And I suppose the good thing about winter varieties is also that we tend to use them, certainly Simpsons, for roasting. And one of the reasons that we use the winter barley is because they're very bold grains. The husk adhesion characteristics are very good. So when we're roasting it, the husk doesn't come away from the grain. It creates a better looking and more processable roasted product or coloured malt product compared to a modern spring variety. Because I think one of the things that we've found when we've gone into modern spring varieties is that because they're bred for more distilling, the husk characteristics are completely different to the winter varieties. So they tend to skin more easily, so the husk comes away. And that's not good for us in terms of when we want to roast that product. So winter varieties for us lend themselves very, very well for use in the roast house. So us as maltsters, we definitely want winter varieties and a good sort of selection of winter varieties because they're the feedstock for our roast house.
I think winters tend to be cheaper than springs, but lower extract.
Yeah.
So there's that wooden dollars thing. You're buying cheaper malt, but you're going to get less from it. So yeah,
Wooden dollars.
yeah, wooden dollars.
Do you hear reports of different? So I appreciate it's like the heritage varieties, which are very much, I guess, flavour and story led and historical process. And of the more modern varieties, do you see or hear reports of flavour differences between, let's say, Planet, Concerto, and Laureate
I know one multinational who won't use Planet.
Okay, because they find
They think there's a flavour. There's a flavour that came through in it. They wouldn't use it more than 20% in a grist. But that's probably the first time that's really happened.
But it's very little difference in flavour really between the three. It's more, as you said, agronomics is driving those.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sort of when you're looking at breeding a new variety, the flavour characteristics that may come out in the malt at the end is not even considered really.
Just breeder, no.
The breeder is purely first thing they look at agronomics. Second they'll start to look at how the end users, and it will affect the end users in terms of processability and such like. So it's flavour characteristics. It's a really interesting one for me, I think, because as Jamie says, a lot of multinational brewers, they will require a blend of at least two different varieties. So you have to give them a blend of at least 20% of one variety and 80% of another, because I think that they're very much looking at impact on flavour and making sure that the malt that they're getting is as consistent as possible, so that the beer that they're making is going to be as consistent as possible in terms of flavour
and processed through the brewery actually as well.
Yeah,
at times.
Much more concerned with back-end filtration than most craft brewers. How have you seen the landscape change for those sort of new varieties? Is there one that's now coming up to the forefront, or is there one in breeding variety behind maybe, or how's that landscape looking in the future looking?
So Planet's died now, and Laureate is king. It's all the way across Europe, isn't it? Laureate as a brewing, and it's in distilling. Yeah, the next one coming through, I believe, scored very low on a certain disease resistance, which I can't remember. The yield was possibly higher, and the growers I've spoken to have kind of said, well, I'd rather have Laureate still than risk this new variety coming through, which I think is Tennyson. Yeah, I think it's Tennyson. So Laureate's going to be around for quite a while.
And is there any other variety, or is the Laureate
Laureate's
top of the...
Yeah, on Springs is everywhere.
Yeah,
really.
I'd say sort of, and it does seem to be quite dominant. Farmers seem to like growing it. They like the sort of the characteristics of it. They know how to grow it. They know what to get from it. How they can get what they need from it. I think us as maltsters like it as a variety. I mean, we do seem to sort of go through. There's a sort of routine churn of varieties, but Laureate seems to have been there for a while. But we do see a routine churn of varieties, as I say, sort of from a UK perspective. I think a lot of it is dominated by distilling. I think distilling has very much become a sort of like a big feature of the UK malting market, because it has grown so hugely over the last decade, I'd say.
So maybe we can just talk quickly about the barley farmer themselves, the barley grower themselves. What's important characteristics in the field for them? What are they looking at to grow good quality brewing barley?
Malting barley is generally light soil, which drains easy. They need to manage their nitrogen and their ag chem to make sure they don't miss out on the premium of it being a malting barley. So once it goes out of spec, it'll go as feed, and they'll lose quite a bit of money. So the farmer does look at his land, and he'll know that a certain field will produce a malting barley, another field won't. You don't tend to get a lot of malting barley in the East Midlands where I live, because the ground's too heavy, and they know that the risk of failing is a big loss of cash, so they basically grow wheat over that way. So yeah, it is quite land related,
Yeah.
That's interesting. And do they use a lot of pesticides and fertilizing? I don't know, in comparison to other crops that they're growing, is it more for...
There'll be less nitrogen going on, definitely, because they're trying to keep the nitrogen down.
Yeah.
And with the nitrogen, it's about when you put it on. It needs to be washed in during the phase where it's growing tillers and stems, but not when it's forming grains. So some years the grain will go on when it's dry, the nitrogen will go on when it's dry, and then it won't rain. And then it rains just as it's setting seed, and then you get a terrible year. Everybody basically has high nitrogen barley. So that's down to the canniness of the grower, when to put the nitrogen on, looking at the weather. I mean, there's a move with the sustainability thing, is actually trying to look at applying nitrogen in a very targeted way, which is a move forward. Before it was just a blanket, chuck it on But there's definitely changes. We're working direct with growers to farm in certain ways.
Yeah.
To reduce the application.
Are you seeing that change? The sort of the demand from customers, demand from, I guess, the wider market for more. I don't want to necessarily use the word sustainable, but I guess maybe less impactful on the environment.
Definitely.
Farming methods.
Yeah. The big companies want that. Definitely, the smaller brewers want that. We're just doing it anyway because we know it's coming, and we want to do that as well anyway. It's something Rich is driven by that as well. So we're kind of going out direct to growers and getting them to, is it FSA Gold?
Yeah,
it's the standard in Scotland, which has sustainability. We've used that word part to it, and I'm sure we'll be doing that down here as well.
And I mean, I guess the buzzword at the moment in malting is regenerative farming. I see some wry smiles.
My point would be is I'm not really sure what either mean. and I think a lot of growers say we've been doing a lot of this. We used to do this, and now we're going back to doing things how we used to do it. And I think as we're going through these different ways of farming, like min till and all those kind of things, they actually raise other problems. So if you don't plough a field, then you're going to get problems with ergot and broom. So you still have to go back and plough. But every field and every farm and every part of the country will have a different requirement in order to reduce the carbon footprint of that crop coming off there. So yeah, the two terms, sustainability and regen, actually cover a massive amount of things that you can do. And there'll be certain fields where you just say you have to plough that and put nitrogen on it or you're not going to get a crop from it.
Is there a situation where, I'm just thinking maybe in the heyday of barley growing, where it was like anyone could do whatever they wanted. Now, do you think these restrictions on becoming more sustainable will actually maybe decrease the quality of the malt going forward, or it decrease yields, or is it going to have any effect, or is it maybe just following different practices to get the same amount for the same?
Just following better practices.
Yeah, okay. I think actually sort of like the technology, the knowledge, the know-how is actually to a certain extent giving us a better result. I think sort of the understanding of what we need to do and how we need to do it is giving us the challenges we have is that climate change is giving us more variability, I think, year to year. So you look at the last few years, we've had very, very sort of, I would say, atypical sort of growing conditions especially for spring barley. So we've had years where we've gone from very high nitrogen to very low nitrogen, dependent upon when we've had the rain, when we've had the sunshine. This year again was very, very strange because we had quite a lot of late rain in sort of the early late winter, early spring. So some farmers were late getting on and drilling their spring crop. So harvest was very, very late this year. And then we had a lot of rain sort of during and around harvest time, which meant that they couldn't get onto the field to harvest. So again, this year's crop is a bit more variable. And I think these challenges are being thrown at us as maltsters, but also as to the farmers who are growing that crop themselves. And I think those challenges are making us better at sort of understanding what we need to do to deliver a good crop. But certainly, there are challenges in terms of delivering a good crop year in, year out. And coming back to sort of your inputs, things like agrochemicals, pesticides. Again, there's a lot of legislation that sort of is tightening up on what farmers can and can't use. And so that presents a challenge, but also an opportunity. But we as the maltsters have to reassure. I mean, food safety is a big part of what we do. So we have to reassure our customers, brewers, distillers, that the malt that we're supplying to them is food safe. So we do all of that analysis to verify that there's no pesticide residues, there's nothing in there that could cause potential issues. So I think all these challenges are actually making us better at delivering something that the brewer wants.
Do you think maybe the move towards sustainable farming, etc., will affect the heritage varieties? Because am I right in knowing that the heritage varieties generally yield less?
They yield less and they are more susceptible to disease. If people still want heritage varieties, farmers will grow them. It's basically down to whether they're willing to pay for them, because they yield lower.
Yeah.
So it's always going to be a price thing. There's people like growing heritage varieties, and they will grow them if there's a market for them.
Yeah, simple as.
Simple as that, basically. Yeah.
It's down to whether you, as the brewer, wants those varieties.
Because you will. Yeah. So last year there wasn't really a premium because barley prices were all very high. But going into next year, you'll start to see a gap again as the spring market price comes back down again. The winters, the likes of Maris will still be up there.
Yeah, I guess Maris Otter is probably going to be there for a long time, isn't it? It's, people really have that belief in the flavour, and I think at all other costs, really. I always thought it was quite interesting because, I've worked in breweries that have had that belief of Maris Otter being the right variety, and that's it. There's no debate whether that goes in or not. It's always there. And then I've worked in other breweries where we've looked at it and gone, it just doesn't make any financial sense. And maybe it comes down to beer recipes and how they evolved.
I think if you're going to lager a beer properly and then put it through a filter and then through a sterile filter, I think you're going to remove anything you got from paying extra from Maris Otter.
And on the other side, I've always said if you're going to dry hop a beer, 15 grams a litre, generally the nuances of a malt variety might be lost. I'm not saying it has, but it might be. But yeah, it was quite interesting. I really like the talk about varieties and how they impact. I think as brewers, we see it on the spec sheet sometimes. I remember when Planet came in, for example, and we had Concerto. Propino was another one. I remember that.
Optic.
And it felt like it was changing all the time, and we were taking different things in. I was,
but yes, you also sort of like the varieties to have different things, like Planet, for example. When Planet was a variety, when it was going through the malting and brewing trials, I think it was a brewer, a European brewer who didn't like processing Planet. It didn't go through the brew house particularly well, and so Planet had a bit of a challenging entry into the marketplace because it didn't immediately get sort of universal approval, and so it was a bit challenged. But different varieties give different sort of positives, different negatives. Planet also is a very proteolytic variety. And so when we come back onto the sort of how it affects the analysis, if you've got quite a proteolytic variety, it'll mean you'll get more soluble nitrogen, more free amino nitrogen potentially, but also because of that you'll get more colour. So Planet as a variety for brewers who want very low colour malt is quite a challenging variety to use because it's very, very proteolytic. So different varieties behave in very, very different ways as well. So it's not just flavour; it's sort of how they malt, how they take up water, how they'll germinate, and that all gives a different kind of set of malt characteristics. And the challenge for us is to take that variety and then be able to turn it into the malt that's consistent for you to be able to use each time. Take into account the fact that each year that changes. So Planet is a proteolytic variety, or has always been, but from year to year, that proteolytic capacity changes. So some years it would be really lots of TSN, you could barely keep the SNR down, and then the other years you'd sort of malt it in the same way, but all of a sudden you wouldn't get the SNR, you wouldn't get the soluble nitrogen. So you then have to change your process. So there's lots of variables that we're looking at. Varieties is one, but crop year is another thing. So we're just about to go into starting to use 2023 crop. So we're now doing lots of micro-malting trials to see how the 2023 crop will behave. So there's lots of work that goes up front ahead of us actually committing 2023 crop to main production, so that we've got some idea of how it will process, because what we did last year might not be what we'll do for this year's crop.
And the grain changes across the year as well, whilst it's in storage. So you have to keep going back and making sure you're doing it correctly. I was going to say another thing on the Planet is the fact that although that brewer didn't like Planet, it sort of proves, because Planet then became probably the first global variety. Basically, the power's in the grower. It's almost like, well, you don't like it, but that's all we're going to grow.
Yes.
Yeah. And now all you can get is Laureate.
Yeah.
it's the growers who are deciding what you're using if you're on modern spring varieties. It's driven by yield.
How do the farmers feel about changing varieties regularly? Is it something that bothers them, or you just thought they just want to do whatever's whatever's killing them?
Yeah, whatever gives them the most.
Sounds of
And it is cash, but for them it's cash per acre.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's a price per ton, but they're actually looking at yield and how much they're going to make.
Yes, because that's
land,
what they're limiting.
Which is why you pay more for low yielding Maris Otter, because they need their money but there's more inputs, etc. for how much they're going to get out of it.
But you have to look at what the decisions they're making. There's a risk in changing variety, because they know with the variety that they've been growing what yield they're going to get. This new variety's coming up. The breeders say, oh, you'll get X yield per acre or whatever, but they don't know that because they've not grown it on their land. So there's an element of risk to them switching from one variety to another. So you can appreciate from a farmer's perspective that yes, a new variety is great if it gives them more yield, but can they achieve that yield on their land? So I think it's important that sort of the farmers give them the credit for what they're doing, because there's a high element of risk in what they're doing from one crop to the next.
And how's the 2023 crop looking, Dan? Give us some heads up.
If you think this is one of, and we as maltsters always say, I've never known a year like it. But it's true.
Every year.
I was going to say that every year. Never known it like it.
But truly, it's been a very, very strange year. I've never known a harvest to go on for so long. And the traditional harvest period for springs would be sort of like late July, early August through to sort of late August, beginning of September, depending upon where you are in the country. Up in Scotland, you still had some farmers who hadn't got their crops in October, tail end of September, which is sort of very bizarre. And down in the south, you sort of like farmers would be sort of like jumping from one rainstorm to another. So they would perhaps harvest one field 1 week, and then there would be a period of rain, and then they would have to wait, and then they would be going and harvesting the next field. Yeah. And that all gave rise to lots of variability from field to field. So it will be a not challenging. It would be an interesting year to see how the 2023 crop processes. I think I've been pleasantly surprised by a lot of the barley that we've seen on our intakes. It's been pretty good. I mean, we have seen some sort of highly weathered barleys, but it's not been too bad. I think we've been quite lucky over the last 3 or 4 years. We've had what I've described as sort of like bleach blonde barley, which is typically Australian-looking barley, because we've had a lot of sunshine through the ripening period, and that's bleached the colour of the grain. So you've got this beautiful golden grain, which is not typical of UK barley. UK barley typically sort of like has a kind of greyish yellow to it, because it does weather in the field. So we've got used to this sort of like, as I say, bleach blonde barley, which looks pretty bold and good. And so this year's crop, a little bit greyish yellow in colour, a little bit weathered, but I think the barley that we've got, we'll see what comes from it, but it doesn't look too bad.
Great. Wow, that's the first time I think I've ever heard. It doesn't look too bad.
But that means good.
Yeah, that means it's outstanding. Probably the best year ever.
But I'm gonna caveat that with, we'll wait and see what the brewer says.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's move on to steeping, which is an important part of the malting process. So maybe Dan, Jamie, you can give us a high-level view of what steeping is aiming to do, and what are the main control points.
So steeping, the interesting about malting is that sort of what we're effectively doing is tricking the barley into growing. So giving it all the conditions it needs to think that it's sitting in the field ready to grow. So steeping is really where we put the moisture in. So barley would have a moisture when we take it in. If it's a particularly wet year, we'll take it in and we'll dry it down. But generally we're looking for moisture in the barley below 14.5%. So it'll go into production, and we're looking over the steeping process to take the moisture from 14.5%, just under 14.5%, up to anywhere between sort of like 43 to 45% moisture. So we're looking to get that moisture into the grain quickly, but in a controlled fashion, so as not to affect the actual germination of the grain. And we're looking for that water uptake to be homogeneous across the batch that we're putting into production. We talked earlier about sort of within a production batch, we've got a huge number of grains. So I think I said earlier that was a bit sad, and I calculated out that in about a 340 to 360 ton batch of barley that we put into process, there's over 6 billion grains. And we're looking to try and get them to do all the same thing at the same time. So take up water homogeneously, start to germinate all at the same time, start to break down the endosperm all at the same time. And the key step for that is steeping. So if we get everything right in steeping, so we get the moisture into the grain, give it the right conditions, temperature, air, then the germination is a lot smoother and a lot easier.
And it all happens at the right time as well. We've got 48 hours to do that. So it steeps, and the steeping process lasts 48 hours. And at the end of that 48 hours, all the grain, the majority of that grain is at the same point of germination. Yeah. It's chit malt, in effect.
Yeah. So what we're looking at the end of steeping is the moisture to be at a certain level, so between 43-45% typically, and the grain to have just started chitting. So the kind of the early signs of root formation coming out of the end of the grain. If we've done our job correctly, the grain will be at that process at that point, and then we can move into germination.
Is the quality of the water important at this stage for what it's steeping in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we use potable water. So we analyse our water very closely to make sure that it complies with all the relevant potable water standards. But yeah, I mean, to the grain, it's just water.
So it's not like, for example, brewing where water is very intrinsic to the flavour of the final product. It doesn't really impact anything down the line, the quality of the water. So if you were to get water from a different part, London water, and steep with London water compared to what you do here in Tyrrell, would that change?
On that, but it's
niche.
It's not something that maltsters think about.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean,
we do recycle.
My next question. Yeah. I preempt me.
Yeah, you can.
My question.
Yeah, reflection in my glasses.
It's the biggest use of liquor on the site.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of
I've seen it in action here and other places. It's a colossal amount of water.
Yeah.
Well, what happens to that now? So is it treated or is it reused?
Well, not all maltsters will reuse water, and I think this is one of the things that's important, because it is one of those things as part of our sustainability agenda, is to reduce the amount of water we're using, because most maltsters will take the water from here at Tyrrell. We've got our own borehole, and we're allowed to take a certain amount of water out per year. And so if we breach that allowance, then it's a problem for us, and we'll have the Environment Agency knocking on the door. So not all maltsters will recycle the water. And one of the reasons we perhaps don't recycle water as much as we should and could do is because there's a little bit of reticence amongst customers to accept recycled water into our process. So I think some brewers are not keen for recycled water to be used.
Right.
Yeah. But one of the things, I mean,
There's another thing about water, isn't there? There's also an inhibitor.
An inhibitor. So yeah, one of the problems we found out early on in the industry when we was looking at whether we could recycle water is there's an inhibitor that gets washed out of the grain when it's steeped. But then when you put that recycled water back onto the next batch, when you're steeping it, that inhibitor inhibits germination. So you have to be careful. So, for example, our Tweed Valley maltings, we use reverse osmosis. So the issue with pesticides is not a problem, and also it removes this inhibitor. So with the correct processing tools, reverse osmosis, ion exchange, all those sorts of things to clean up the water, the water is perfectly usable. And we do use it at Tweed Valley Maltings. So it is one of those things which is quite important, because we're looking to sort of reduce our demand on water, because it's the right thing to do. Water is a precious resource. Certainly in the south, it's becoming a very scarce resource. But being able to reuse water, I think, is one of those things that's quite important.
I suppose it's about the equipment then. So we've got it at Tweed Valley because we've spent a lot of money on the equipment to reuse the water.
Yeah, whereas
I'm sure it'll happen down here at some point, but if you've got a small maltings or big maltings, you get more effect for your money if you do it in the big maltings first.
Yes. Yeah, I totally understand. So is there anything else within the steeping process that you look for, or should we move on to germination?
Well, I mean, the key things is moisture, providing oxygen, and temperature. So those are the things that we're looking at during steeping and pretty much all the way through the process. So we're looking to make sure that we control the temperature. So again, it's a bit sort of Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, and making sure that the grain gets enough oxygen. Because when it starts to germinate, it will start to produce carbon dioxide. And if the grain gets exposed to high levels of carbon dioxide, it starts to impact the germination. So we're always pumping fresh air through the grain to remove that carbon dioxide. So in steeping, we'll have what we call a wet and a dry phase. And during the wet phase, the grain is completely underwater, but we pump air through it, so we oxygenate the water to keep oxygen levels in the grain high. And then we drain the tank down and go into an air phase, or dry phase. We're pulling air through it to remove any carbon dioxide buildup that may happen during that process. So steeping, we're doing lots of things to make sure that we're controlling the environment that the grain is sitting in, so that it's got the best conditions to be able to germinate and give us the best quality malt. So yeah, steeping, water, air, and temperature.
And the steeping process of wets and airs will change by variety and crop year and as the year progresses, just to keep adjusting to get to that point, which is why we do the micro malting. So basically we're looking at the 2023 crop and seeing what's the best relationship to get the best crop from that.
But we'll also change through the year, because as Jamie said earlier, the crop changes throughout the year. So at certain points, the grain will sort of not behave in the way that it had been behaving because it's matured. And you're sort of thinking, all right, okay, I'm going to have to take a few hours out of my wet, or add a few hours into my wet, or extend the air phase or the dry phase. So that skill of the maltster is to be able to sort of identify when they need to change their process to be able to optimize the malt quality coming out.
And that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Modern Brewer podcast. This is part 1 of 3 parts. So part 2 is going to cover germination and kilning, and part 3 is going to cover all of the COA data and how it impacts the brew house, including the most important parameters and the ones as brewers put too much value in. It's going to be essential listening, and all 3 parts are going to interlink to give you a full understanding of malt COAs and how they impact the brewery. So big thanks so far to Jamie and Dan, and if you guys want to continue to listen to this, make sure you hit the subscribe or follow button so you don't miss part 2 or part 3 of this mini series. Thank you so much for everyone listening, and I'll catch you on part 2 of the Modern Brewer podcast.